I actually did my PhD in anthropology and my postdoctoral research in the Pacific in New Caledonia, and that has driven essentially a 17-year consultancy career since I left academia. I didn't quite get 100 in cricket in terms of, got 97 PhD and master students through their candidacies. And I'm currently working in a whole lot of areas that look specifically at gender and human rights, integrated water management, climate change and disaster risk reduction, and community consultation and stakeholder engagement. So today I'm going to be focusing a great deal on these issues, particularly from the point of view of human rights, and also the way in which they integrate with climate change and climate resilience. Again, because that's a key focus of Australia's funding agencies. So, what I'd like to do is to start off with a little bit of an exercise, and I'm going to just mix these up a little bit. With those of you who have a blue sticker, please stand up. So a blue sticker, we need you to stand up. Lovely. So, many of you might remember we will give you, got a blue sticker? Lovely. Might remember that in 2005 a massive tsunami came across the Indian Ocean, hit the coast of Thailand and hit Aceh in Indonesia. What actually happened following that tsunami, because it was a major disaster that hit a range of countries, research was done to find out who was the most damaged in any community. And for those of you who have a blue sticker, I hate to tell you this, but you did not survive. Okay?
So I'm dead.
So we will just leave you there as a memorial to the people that we lost. Would those of you who have a yellow sticker please stand up? So a light yellow sticker. So now you can stand up with everyone else. Going to get you moving. Okay. So those of you who have a yellow sticker, you are people with a disability, and you also did not survive. So many people who had a physical disability were actually also victims of that particular disaster. Okay. So we're beginning to see that there's a lot of people in the community who are actually damaged. Okay. Those of you who have an orange sticker, could you stand up, please? So you are the family members who lost someone in the disaster. Okay. So you actually have someone that you loved who was also lost. So if we start to look at the proportion of the community who were actually damaged by that disaster, we're starting to see that it impacted a lot of people. And those of you who have a green sticker, I'm really sorry, but you wrote the policies that did not plan for gender and disability inclusion in your climate disaster planning. Okay? So you did not go into the communities and talk with people about what needed to be done to protect them in a major emergency. Okay? And these are the percentages that we start to see following major disasters. So what we really want to do, and one of the things we found in terms of writing climate disaster plans, is that they're generally written by men, and they're generally written by men who are engineers. So we can see that unless we go out and talk with a lot of people to actually work out what the impacts might be of a climate disaster, we actually end up making things worse for people. So thank you very much. Sit down. So you can see that when I start talking about gender and disability, it has real world impacts. It's not some vague academic exercise that we like to do to say we need to get more women into policy making. It actually has real world impacts. So what we're going to do today is to talk a little bit about what is GEDC. So when we talk about gender and social inclusion, we're generally defining it as gender equality. How can we make women have a greater voice in what might impact them in terms of the planning and the policy and the designs that we're actually engaged in? How can we include disability? So when Jianbing did a presentation this morning about creating a picnic space with an actual slope down to the water, my immediate thinking was, how do we get people with a disability out of that area if something goes wrong? Okay, so we do have the real world actions we can take. And then social inclusion, I'm going to talk about that in terms of what are the socially vulnerable groups that we need to be aware of. People with a disability, perhaps mothers who are women who are pregnant. It might be young girls and the safety of women and children in particular environments. Then I'm going to talk about why should we actually do it. So because you're going to be the trainers and the leaders in these kinds of solutions in the future, we need to understand why we're actually going to talk about these things and how and what we're going to do. And then we're going to talk about how do we include it in our climate change planning and nature-based solutions. So we're looking at things like who is actually impacted, who is able to participate in stakeholder and community consultation. I've worked with clients who deliberately plan stakeholder engagement and community consultation at 10 o'clock in the morning because most of the men would be at work and most of the women would be dropping off children at school or coming back from that. They did not want to engage with the community, so they created it at a time when most people would not be available. That is bad community engagement, okay? Then we need to talk about who's going to benefit from the kind of projects that you're engaged in and who might be left out. So that's essentially what I'll be taking you through this morning. So we're going to talk about in the beginning what are the legal and political frameworks. So you can see here that we're trying to get some kind of balance between women and men. We've done that beautifully in this room today, where we've got an equal proportion of women as well as men in the room. And then we're going to talk about how can we actually start including more groups into our concept of equality. And that might be, at the moment, just visually looking at you, I cannot see someone who has an actual visible physical disability. So what are the ways in which we might, in fact, bring people with a disability into our discussions a little bit more? So if we actually talk about who is impacted, one of the key frameworks that I think is really, really helpful is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what we're actually looking at is how can we apply human rights to designing, planning and implementing JEDC policies, projects and activities. How can we actually get a greater, more equitable distribution of benefits to people? So there's ways in which we can think about it in terms of our frameworks, and I know with many people who have a Buddhist background, we might actually then use that philosophy to create a kind of an ethical approach. I don't want my work to harm anybody. I don't want my work to hurt anybody. And that's absolutely fine, but it has a limitation. It's individual. You might in fact be talking with someone who's a major client who's funding your project, and they might be an individual who says, I don't care about human rights, I'm not interested in it, I want this to be the most profitable project that we work on. So what do you do as an individual when you've got someone who is a manager who doesn't understand that point of view? So then if we look at the legal, political and human rights approach, we begin to extend our responsibility out from the individual into society and into our political structures. We actually have a social obligation and a political obligation through the policies that our government has signed up to and the conventions to actually do the right thing. We also then need to understand that the donors or funding organisations, for example, we are here today because of our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Australia and our aid program, and they require that we talk to you about human rights. Okay? So there's a financial and a social obligation that starts to come into the equation. And then, as Jianbing indicated with many of the projects that in his presentation, you can actually have a commercial or a business benefit that comes from the work that you do. So you might do a nature-based solutions project trying to minimize the cost, but in fact it might have extraordinary good commercial benefits. So whenever I look at these, I actually think, what are the ways in which we can bring them all together under the legal framework of human rights in order to understand what our responsibilities are? So one of the financial benefits, a project that I worked on in Bhutan, where the World Bank had actually financed the building of latrines, of toilets, in all of the primary schools in Bhutan. This was about maybe 15 years ago. They spent $7 million, and they actually had the building project and so forth. They did that without any community consultation. And when they finished building it, and the people went in to monitor and evaluate the project, they said, the buildings are fabulous, however, they're not actually built to be disability accessible. So the teachers and the children who had a disability could not get into the toilet block where they were actually able to use the facilities. The other thing that they did was they didn't take on board, particularly with some of the older girls in the schools, that they had particular needs, they had particular biological needs as girls, as women. And so one of the reasons why girls and young women stay away from school once a month, often up to a week at a time, is because of menstrual health issues. And there was no place in these school washrooms for the girls to actually change and wash and do what was required. And so the girls continued to stay away from school for 1 week every month because there were no facilities to assist them. That meant that the girls, over each year that they went through their teenage years, fell further and further back in educational activity. And so we can see that something as simple as not designing for the needs of young women can have a really dramatic negative social impact. Okay? So the World Bank then had to fund another project that actually made these toilet blocks disability accessible and provided some areas for young girls to be able to tend to their biological needs. And that cost another $7 million. So retrofitting buildings that are already up is more costly. It's up to 28% more in cost to retrofit a building for disability access, whereas if you design for disability access, it's an extra 1%. So the commercial and financial benefits of actually designing in equality of access from the beginning are ones that we already understand and know about. So here in terms of the funding organisations, most donors now, the Asian Development Bank as well as Australia and USAID and so forth, are actually funding JEDSI and climate resilience projects. So they don't just say that equality stands alone. They're saying, what does the need for equality mean in terms of making sure that people are protected against climate disasters in the future? So these two go together, they're married essentially in funding terms. Okay. So one of the reasons why we actually start to look at, particularly at women and girls, not just in biological terms and in needs of biological needs, but also in terms of political equality and economic equality, is that the World Economic Forum has done a major global gender gap report. And so it found that the ability to achieve worldwide equality between women and men is still quite a long way off. And what they actually say is that we actually need to have more projects to be designed and implemented to ensure that women, people with a disability, and members of socially vulnerable groups are included. So they're saying we now need to design projects right from the start with that inclusion as a driver of what the project is going to look like. So what they're actually saying is that as of 2020, so we're now only 90 years rather than 95 years, to close the political gap. So that's actually getting women into positions of power, running major organizations, CEOs of organizations, running departments in government, actually in political power in government. That's still going to take us about 90 years to close that gap where women's voices are heard. And in terms of the economic gap, it's going to take us 252 years. This is the massive gap that we have between what men are paid for the work that they do and what women are paid for the work that they do. Here in Australia, we've got around about a 12% gap between men and women in terms of payment. That 12% per annum would be the amount of money that women would be able to put into superannuation to ensure that they were not impoverished when they actually left the workforce. At the moment in Australia, the largest growing social group of homeless people is women over the age of 50, because they have not benefited from an equal pay throughout their career. They've often taken time out of the workforce to raise children. They've taken time out of the workforce to look after elderly parents. By the time they get to 50, if their husband has moved on or has passed away or they don't have a partner, it means that they are often without a house to live in. Okay? So this is something that Australia is beginning to address through its gender pay gap, because we can see the real world consequences on women of not being paid equally. So the World Economic Forum's platform is that to actually state that we now have a platform for shaping the future of the new economy and society. It's actually saying, here we are in the 21st century, we've got to do something about this on a global scale. And the most important thing that they're actually looking at, and they're working with 100 of the world's leading companies, is that they want to integrate equality and inclusion into the new economy, aiming to reach 1 billion people with improved economic opportunities. So this is where we're starting to see the actual global planning to make sure that the kind of situation we have in Australia, where 50 women over the age of 50 don't have anywhere to live, is actually addressed in the international arena. So this impacts Thailand, it impacts Vietnam, it impacts the Pacific Islands, it impacts Australia and New Zealand, Europe, and so forth. So we've got a couple of strategies that we can actually link to, which are really helpful. These are written by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, runs our aid program, and we actually have one which is Australia's International Disability Equity and Rights Strategy, and we also have an International Gender Equality Strategy. Now, those of us who advise the government say this is all very well. What we actually need is to have these two strategies melded together so that we're not working under gender here and disability here and social vulnerability there. We want you to work as a government to bring it all together, because our clients can get quite confused about what it is that they're supposed to do. But they're really, really good links and starting points to think about these kinds of issues if you're wondering how to integrate it into your actual work practice. So that's a little bit about what GEDC is. What I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about how can we define it so that we can drill down and have a clearer understanding of the various social groups that we're focusing on. So as I indicated before, GEDC is actually gender equality. It includes disability, so the Australian government has pulled disability out as a separate group because they said if we don't talk about disability, if we don't pull it out and address it, it just disappears. It becomes too hard. So they've incorporated gender equality, disability, and then more broadly social inclusion. So another little exercise here. What we have in the social sciences is the concept of identity. So having walked into this room this morning, I have hair that's a little bit longer than most men would have. I'm wearing a little bit of makeup. I'm an older person. I'm dressed in a way that's socially acceptable in Australia for a woman to dress. I actually speak English as my first language. These are ways in which I have constructed a social identity. It's how people look at me and identify who I am, and it's also how I present myself. So if I actually had a look at this wheel, I will begin to be able to say, okay, I'm actually female, I present as a woman in terms of my gender, I'm relatively wealthy as a in terms of social economic status because I'm a business person and an academic. My national origin is Australian. My first language is English. I don't, to my knowledge, have a disability. My age is my business and my business alone. I'm an elder of the community. I have just a very gentle kind of spiritual affiliation, and I can be seen to be white. So we can see here that there's a number of categories that we can use to understand people's identity. What I would like you to do is to look at that identity wheel and write down the 3 key identities that you think of yourself. So in my case it would be, I'm a woman, I am Australian, and I have a high socioeconomic status. They're the 3 key things that, present about me as I front up in a room. So just for the moment, 3 key identities by which you define yourself. Have a little bit of a think about that. Now, would anybody like to volunteer the 3 key things by which they identify themselves? Yes.
First one, I'm male, not female. And my first language is also Thai, and my nationality is Thai also.
Thai. Excellent. Okay. So we can see there that this gentleman decided to define himself initially as being male, and then there was a language and a national identification. So in terms of your own 3 things, what is the key, the first identity by which you would identify yourself? Thai? Yeah. So nationality?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? Gender? Okay, so male or female or non-binary? Okay.
Race.
Race? So being of the Thai people?
Yeah, maybe Asian.
Asian? Okay, so that's a big region. Okay, that's really interesting. And I think that particularly given today, we've got the focus on being Thai because you're actually in another country, and so you're, okay, I'm Thai, and then there's the rest of the world. In most cases, and anthropologically in every culture in the world, the primary identification has been, are you male or are you female? So when we actually look at the key identity that people have, it's actually male or female. So if people actually began to walk into this room, and even as you got on the bus this morning, without even thinking it, I was going, oh, we've got 4 men, and oh, now there's 2 girls who've come on board, and oh, another 2 men, and now there's 3 other women who've come on board. I was beginning to try and calculate what the gender balance in the group was. Okay, so gender is very, very important in every society, and in the way that we act in the world. Now, we have a look at that wheel to get the categories, but we are never just a male, we are never just a female. When I was identifying myself, I'm an older woman, I have English as a first language and so forth, so there are all sorts of ways in which I would present to you. And we actually call that idea intersectionality. And this is an idea that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is very keen on doing when we write our proposals for funding. They want to see us writing, how do we address intersectionality? So if we actually have a look at these kinds of identities, we can see that biological sex and social gender in the middle is the most important, but all these other identities become important too. So what we actually need to understand is that people have multiple layered identities. So in Thailand it might be a young Hmong man with a physical disability and a low level of education. Now in Australia, most young men are actually quite socially powerful. They're often earning more money, their voices are listened to, they're actually quite powerful. But in Australia, if we had a young First Nations boy with a physical disability and not much education, he would not be a very powerful young man. So even though the stereotype of young men is that they're powerful, when we start to drill down through the intersections, we can see that certain kinds of young men are not powerful. We can see also that people can simultaneously experience oppression and privilege. And this might be a woman in Afghanistan who's trained as a doctor but isn't allowed to work. Now, if we know about the political situation in Afghanistan, we know that women cannot leave the house, they cannot go out to work. The Taliban will actually hurt them or shoot them. So the family might say, no, mum, you can't go out to work because it's too dangerous. So as a woman, she is simultaneously privileged because of her education, but oppressed because she's a woman. Okay? And that's a political situation that exists in Afghanistan. And then sometimes we actually might see a combination of identities creating different types of disadvantage. And this might be in Thailand an old man in a remote border refugee camp who belongs to a tribal group that has very little land. So again, we might say here in Australia, most older men are quite powerful. It's only in the last 10 years that in Australia we have seen large numbers of women come into Parliament. But prior to that, it was 95% white men in power in Parliament. Okay, so we might say, okay, older men in Australia generally have a lot of power, but if they're an older man who is a refugee, who doesn't have much money, who doesn't have much land, again, not very powerful. So I'm actually giving you these examples because I don't want to be the woman who stands out the front here and says, all men are bad, all women are lovely. It doesn't work that way. Okay, we need to be able to get the nuances and the subtleties to understand, for example, the differences between women in Luang Prabang, who might actually be community advisors on a project, and people who might be working in a government department in Bangkok, who might have a very different kind of power and level of power. We need to be able to understand those differences. So if we actually have a look at gender, we can find that, and this is useful for when we're understanding people who are non-binary, so the LGBTQI plus group. Gender identity determines how we are perceived and how we're expected to think and act as women. So if I had come in here with this morning with really, really short hair, no makeup, boots on my feet, jeans, a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, there might have been a moment or two when you thought, is she a woman or not? Because of the way in which I was presenting myself. So there are expectations around how we're expected to think and act as women and men. As I said before, gender is a fundamental part of social identity, and we learn it through socialization. So I have learned to fluff my hair in the mornings. I have learned how to apply lipstick. I have learned when I was younger how to wear high heels. So this is all part of learning how to be male and female in a society. We also find that socialization can normalize inequality in social roles. So there might be a lot of people in Australia who will say, for example, well, if a woman over the age of 50 doesn't have a house to live in, it's her fault. What did she do wrong? Didn't she save enough money? Why didn't she invest in the future? Why didn't she put some of her income into superannuation? There are people who will actually normalize that kind of economic inequality and not want to do anything about it. So we need to understand that, and then we also need to understand that gender is changing and dynamic. It's always shifting. Here in Australia, we have had a discussion around the transgender rights, which has really expanded over the last 5 years. Prior to that, to be transgender was really not something that most people talked about. Okay. And gender is also different in different cultures. So the way in which non-binary people might enact their performance of gender is very different in Thailand to the way that it might be enacted here in Australia. So we need to just be aware of all of these things. Okay. Now, why is this focus on gender so important? And I've actually pulled these ideas from work that I've done up in Papua New Guinea, which is a very, very gender-divided society. And essentially what we find is that there are different ideas about appropriate work, where we find often women's work is unpaid. Okay? So that's why they can be homeless at the age of 50. Different access to education, so where you might have 50-50 in terms of girls and boys in primary school, might go to 75 boys and 25 girls in secondary school, might go to 98% boys and 2% girls in university. And that's certainly the kind of difference we see in Papua New Guinea. You might have different access to healthcare, where women maybe need to be accompanied by men when they're travelling. So if, for example, you live in a village and it's 50 kilometres to the nearest health post, you can't, in Papua New Guinea, you can't hop in a canoe and row yourself down the river. You actually have to go with one of the men in your family to access healthcare. Also, there's a sense that women and girls may not be considered capable of making decisions. And previous work that I've done in Thailand, particularly around the community water user groups, we find that most of the water user groups in terms of the decision makers are generally male. So they will often bring women in for discussions, or they'll have meetings with women, but the people who are making the decisions in the water user groups and communities are usually male. Okay? And that then means that there's a different access to political power, where women's concerns may not be recognised, may not be understood, or not represented. And these all lead to a basis for human rights abuses, where you've actually got potential for increase in domestic violence, sexually transmitted infections, and child labour. So again, real world examples of the different ways in which gender plays out in society. Now let's have a look at disability. So I said earlier that looking around this room, I couldn't see that anyone had a visible disability. Okay, so that might be someone who's got an arm that hurts, or is seated in a wheelchair or whatever. So what we actually see are visible and invisible disabilities. Physical disabilities, and then non-physical psychosocial, intellectual and cognitive disabilities. People with autism, for example, people with ADHD might come into this category. When we actually look at disability, the World Health Organization has said that in any society in any particular time, 15% of the population will actually have a disability. However, when we look at that impact of that tsunami back in 2005, in Aceh, they had the same percentage of disability as everyone else, but following the impact of the tsunami, their disability percentage of the community went up to 38%. So this is where focusing on disability is really important, because you need to understand the local context where disability might be a little bit different to what you're expecting it to be. And that needs to be investigated to help you to plan accordingly. So we can see that there might be multiple barriers to people actually with a disability engaging with wonderful nature-based solutions projects that you're designing. That it might be accessibility, it might be attitudes where there might be very negative thoughts about people with a disability, or a stigma, we don't want to include them. There might be laws or regulatory frameworks that don't actually protect the human rights of people with a disability. And there might be communication in terms of information and resources that aren't available to people with a disability. And I speak about that in terms of a project I was doing in Fiji, which is in the Pacific. Fiji has had a number of rogue waves, and they're not tsunamis, but they're rogue waves hit the coastline, completely difficult to predict. And what actually happens is that there's no communication about the waves that are actually coming. So when they hit, what you find is that people with a disability might be stuck in a house, like a little grass hut that's the size of this table, with no food and no water for anything up to 4 days before people can come to find them. So that's actually documented impacts on people with a disability. And whenever I speak to engineers about what their communication is for actually advising people with a disability of a climate change, a climate disaster, they say, oh, we're going to set up sirens. And I'll say, okay, that's fine. You've got sirens, which will be terrific for people who are hearing abled. What are you going to do to help people who are not hearing abled, who actually have a disability in hearing? And they say, just going to go away and think about that for a little bit. So again, it's all a part of the design and planning process, that it needs to be built in right from the front. So we can see that people with a disability may not actually be well considered, but we do have a number of reports that are actually dealing with the issue of climate change and economic degradation on children in Thailand. So there are reports that are already speaking to the kinds of issues that you might need to consider in your home country. Now we have a look at the idea of socially vulnerable groups. Now, I worked a number of years ago with one of the world's largest transnational corporations. We won't speak its name because it has been doing dreadful things in the resource sector. We tried to educate them. And they always used the World Bank as their kind of baseline for what it is that they had to do to protect themselves. And so we ended up integrating the World Bank's International Finance Corporation's guidance note on socially vulnerable groups. So what this particular definition does is it looks at race, colour, sex, language, religion, and nationality, and so forth, much as we had in that identity wheel earlier on. But then it starts to factor in other issues such as gender, age, ethnicity, literacy, sickness, physical or mental disability, poverty, and so forth. So we have a very, very detailed definition there of what socially vulnerable groups are. And when you go out into your local communities, you need to be able to understand what the key groups are in that community. So if, for example, you're working on the border between Thailand and Myanmar, it may well be that refugee groups are one of the key groups that you need to focus on. If you're actually working down on the border of Thailand with Malaysia, it may well be people with a religious difference who actually need to be focused on. So what we find here is that generally as consultants, we're nearly always focusing on women, people with a disability. We like to link in the elderly because often even though they may not have a disability, they may be a bit slower than people who are 20 or 30 years old. Young people and children, we need to often link women and children together because one of the things we found with so many women who actually passed away in the tsunami, a lot of the women were actually pregnant. And as we all know, when you're carrying an extra 6 or 7 kilograms in your tummy, you're not going to sprint as fast as your average 14-year-old. So we do need to be very, very careful about linking women and their child caring responsibilities. We also focus on people of ethnic and religious minority groups and gender diversity where that's culturally appropriate. And I do have to pop that in because in some communities, particularly I found in some of the islands in the Indonesian archipelago, when I go into some of the villages, they actually do not understand the concept of being non-binary or LGBTQI+. So you need to be very, very culturally sensitive when you're doing work with some communities and their particular worldviews. So we get a sense here of who our socially vulnerable groups are. We've got some nice images here, women who are pregnant or people who are carrying babies, people with a physical disability, and so on and so forth. So we then need to say we've done the what and the why. We're going to go on to the why, but why should we include women, people with a disability in different ethnic groups, and then who benefits from climate change planning and management and NBS projects? So we're going to speak a little bit about the why. So here we have the Dalai Lama. Okay? So in 2005, he made a statement where he said he believes the 21st century can become the most important century of human history. I think a new reality is emerging. Now, when I was young, I go back even further than having to carry a Walkman and a phone and a camera and the discs that went into the Walkman. When I was young, the only thing I had to worry about was not being eaten by a dinosaur. So this has been a very long learning curve for me. Okay, so when we actually have a look at the 21st century, we now have global connections in ways that did not exist for most of my life. Okay, so when I was young, we understood that nationality was a barrier. It was very, very different. To be Thai was very, very different to being a New Zealander. to be a New Zealander was very, very different to being an Australian. Okay, so we had those barriers. Most of those barriers now are beginning to, I won't say collapse, but reduce as a result of our ability to communicate with each other. And that's what the Dalai Lama was talking about. We can now create a new reality. And in some ways that fits into NBS Solutions, where my father was a civil engineer. All hail civil engineers, he was a wonderful man. But his remit was to actually build reservoirs and to build retaining walls to try and minimize landslides going into apartment buildings in Hong Kong or taking out roads and so forth. So he had a very strong technical approach to resolving issues. As Jianbin has pointed out, we now have the ability to do small-scale, local, community-based projects that don't take a lot of money, don't take a lot of expertise, that local people themselves can create and maintain over time. So we've got much more of a spectrum of choice now. So we've got a new reality that we're operating in. James Ping, who's a CEO of Pony AI, has argued that we need to be using technology to have a positive societal impact. That needs to be our key ambition. So if we're doing things with AI, we need it to be beneficial. If we're creating nature-based solutions projects, they need to be beneficial to society and to assist communities. And in terms of Justin Warland, who's Times CO2 leadership, he's actually talking here, and this is really close to my heart. He's talking about the location of data centers where the energy that is required to run them. He's stating that in Brazil, their current electricity system has a 90% renewable energy rate, which is extremely high. Here in Australia, we're still struggling to try to meet that. The difficulty with looking at these new technologies is that you can't look at them as a standalone commercial benefit. You actually have to say, what's the broader environmental and social impact going to be? And what we actually find is that large data centers consume up to 19 million litres of water per day in order to cool the data centers, and that use is equivalent to a town populated between 10 to 50,000 people. So we might look at the data centers and we might look at the cloud as being wonderful ways of actually moving information around and getting new renewable energy business into town, but we do need to start to look at what are its environmental and social impacts. Okay? So even though we've got these very dynamic and forward-thinking ideas about the future, we need to be very, very anchored on the ground. What is it going to do to our people? Okay, oops. Here we go. Now, why should we include JETSI? This is going back to the legal frameworks and the human rights frameworks I was talking about before. Thailand has signed up to a whole range of international conventions. So this is kind of like the socio-political, legal, top-down approach to what you're doing. If you're actually talking to someone a little bit further up management and they're saying, we're not going to do that because it's going to cost too much money, if you can actually see that there are going to be negative impacts, you can say, you have signed these conventions. Thailand needs to report back to the UN on its way of doing these, enacting these conventions. So we've got, for example, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Convention for the Rights of the Child, the Protocol relating to the status of refugees, the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability. So you've actually got these very, very strong conventions that give you a legal framework and a legal reason for saying we've got to make our NBS projects socially and environmentally safe. The other approach that's really important for example, for DFAT, our funding agency in Australia, is that we will link up to the United Nations, where the United Nations actually has a do no harm approach. So it won't fund anything and it doesn't approve any project that is actually going to harm people. Tell that to some of the transnational corporations. And the other one is that leave no one behind. And they have a document here from their water development report in 2019, which is actually how we can do that in ways that people are actually empowered and able to design projects that are going to affect their future. So what we find is that people are left behind when they lack choices and opportunities to participate in and to design development progress. So we need to make sure that they are incorporated right from the start, not halfway along the project. So, the most important part, how do we do JETSI? So we've had the what is it, and hopefully you've got a slightly clearer understanding now about why we focus on women, people with a disability, the elderly, young people and children, and so forth. And we've got that we do it because there are legal frameworks, there are rights and conventions that Thailand has signed up to, there are ways in which we need to make sure that people have human rights that are addressed. And now we start to drill down a little bit. Okay, so there are two ways to actually look at mainstreaming JETSI into your projects. One is at the organizational level, and I'm not going to talk about this a lot today. This is actually what's going on in RID itself, okay? And that means that there are going to be changes to policy, structure, and the culture of the organization, and that's through changing internal policies, programming, and human resources. And I have actually worked with another section of RID where we have written a JETSI action plan, and it talks to your head office, and it then talks about what needs to be done at the provincial level. So that part of that is actually begun and ongoing. But more importantly, how can you integrate JETSI into every step of every project cycle? So within RID as an organisation, we would then need to think about these kinds of issues. So what are the regional policies, legislation and policies that are relevant to Thailand that relate to JETSI? And that can be things like the constitution and any bills of rights, national goals and directive principles, strategic development plans and so forth, any national policies about women, people with a disability, other socially vulnerable groups. If you've got a country gender assessment and family protection bills. So these are the kinds of things where you're looking upwards more broadly from RID to find out what your legal responsibilities are. And so I'm just going to, yeah. So again, if we're looking at what's going on in RID, we're actually looking at project stages where we're looking at using gender analysis tools that are adapted to JETSI, analysing data, planning and design, and having monitoring, evaluation, learning indicators, implementing it throughout the organisation, and then reporting on what it is that you're doing. So that's what we're actually doing in terms of the policy cycle. And then we need to think about conducting a JETSI analysis. So when we look at what we're doing within our organisation, we're actually saying, okay, we need to understand what some of the issues are and identify those. We need to gather evidence about what those particular issues are, identify outcomes, start doing some planning and communication, implement our JETSI approach and do our monitoring and evaluation and reporting. So the Queensland Government Office for Women has actually developed a gender analysis toolkit that enables us to start to look at these kinds of issues and apply them to what it is that we're doing within our organisation. So if, for example, I was a head of a new section in RID, one of the things that I would be doing is finding out what projects people are working on, and then I would actually be saying, what are the ways in which we've got an equal number of female engineers and male engineers working on that project together. If we have a numerically high number of men who are working on a project, I would be saying, why is that the case? I understand we've got particular expertise among some of the senior men. Are we able to bring on one or two young junior female engineers so that they can shadow on the project and begin to learn from the project? So you're starting to create a culture within the organisation that enables men and women to start to begin to get that gender equality. So again, we're not looking at that kind of 12% financial difference that we see here in Australia between what men are earning and what women are earning. So within the JEDC plan that we've written for RID, we actually have a tool for the head office in terms of an action plan. And this is basically looking at developing staff competence on JEDC mainstreaming in the induction and ongoing training sessions, establishing a JEDC unit with a clear mandate to promote and support JEDC mainstreaming within the organisation, conducting a JEDC audit. How many women do we have? What age are they? Do they have a disability? How many men do we have? What age are they? Do they have a disability? Getting that data about our organisation's people. Organising for a budget, because you can't have changes within an organisation without a budget taking place. Developing indicators to measure management commitment to mainstreaming, accountability mechanisms and key performance indicators, and then developing RID project guidelines and so forth. Now, all of these have actually been agreed to by RID head office and are going to be rolled out over the next year or two. So we've got some momentum within RID to have some change within the organisation, which is quite good. That will help to consolidate and give you a basis to do your projects into the future when you're actually dealing with communities. So if we now look at JEDC and RID projects, we're looking particularly at who's able to participate in stakeholder and community consultation, and then who benefits from climate change planning and MDS projects, and then who might be left out. So I indicated to you before that right at the beginning of thinking about a project, we want to get our communities on board. Okay? So this is not a good idea in terms of stakeholder engagement. You don't actually want to have the people beginning to knock down trees and people's houses and extend canals and so forth without actually having advised them that some changes are going to take place. So this is the worst case scenario for stakeholder engagement. What we really want to do is to actually, for the purposes of our stakeholders and their human rights, is we need to recognise people who have an effect on, are impacted by, or have an interest in a project, initiative or intervention. So this really begins to expand the way in which we think about our people. Now if I could just jump in, could I ask you just to stand to the side for 1 moment, because I want to do something a little bit visual here. When I used to talk to the engineers in that transnational corporation, I used to say to them, so you've got a major pipeline and a liquid natural gas facility. So your pipeline is coming down from the highlands, is coming through 258 different tribal communities to a liquid natural gas processing facility here. Okay? So we're actually looking at what's happening in terms of social impacts through those 258 tribal communities and what's happening to the social impacts of building a liquid natural gas processing facility. And I would say to them, from your training, you're focused on this. And others who might be architects are focused on this. From the point of view of social and environmental impact assessment, we are focused on that. So your technical focus is a very, very small part of what we're actually looking at in terms of the potential for your project to damage people. And we want to minimize that damage as much as we can. So what the various clients would do is they would say, okay, we're going to have 5 kilometres on this side and 5 kilometres on that side, and we're going to call that our target area. And then when we have the liquid natural gas processing plant, we're going to have 5 kilometres around the processing plant as well. And we said, okay, we'll start there. But when you've dealt with people who actually live in villages, as you would know in Thailand, they don't all sit nicely within a boundary. So you will have a family here and brothers and sisters who are over here. So they actually live in networks, in social networks. So that 5 kilometre boundary was a useful starting point, but we actually had to start working with social network theory in order to make it more effective. We also found that with one of the organisations I worked with, which was a gold mine up in northern Queensland, and we thought this is going to be straightforward. It's been there for 40 years, they want to expand the gold mine, we'll talk with the local community, this will be really simple. What they do in the gold mine when they pull the gold out of the ground is they put it into a big kind of swimming pool. It looks gorgeous, it's turquoise in colour, it's 38 degrees outside, you're looking at this pool and you think, I'd love to swim in that. And the engineers just say, no you wouldn't, it will strip all of the skin off your arms if you even go anywhere near it. But what they were doing with that particular cleaning facility, they were cleaning with cyanide. And cyanide was leaking out from that cleaning facility into the local waterways. So there were downstream impacts of cyanide entering the water system. So we thought, okay, Northern Queensland, our state laws will deal with this, not a problem. Wasn't the case. The cyanide was travelling all the way through the river systems to the coast, and here we have the Great Barrier Reef. So the environmental impact brought in the federal government in Canberra. So we actually then had to start working to the federal government laws. But it was bigger than that, because not only were you damaging the animals and the water, you were damaging the people whose farmlands and whose stock were actually drinking from that water. And then when you got to the coast, you were actually damaging the tourism industry that is all along the coast and in all of the Great Barrier Reef Islands. So the social and economic impacts were as great as the environmental impacts. So what we originally planned to be this really, really small social and environmental impact assessment ballooned. It was just enormous because of one small issue with cyanide leakage. With this project, where we've got the pipeline and the liquid natural gas facility, here we had a jetty that was going out into the Gulf of Papua, and the big LNG tankers were going to come in from China and actually load up at the jetty. So the oil and gas would come down through the pipeline, it would be processed in this facility, it would be transported along the jetty and then pumped straight into the big tankers. What we found was that the villagers who lived around here, the women would go to this particular section, which is where all of the, what do they call it? I had a senior moment. For want of a better term, all of the greenery along here, where, what are they called? They're in rivers and they suck up all of the nutrients. Like that? It's a particular
Marsh.
area. What marsh? It'd come to me at lunchtime or 3 o'clock. So they would walk along this area and they would actually collect the shellfish and the sand crabs and so forth, and they would collect some of the greenery along this area. So this was an area that was going to be stripped in order for the jetty to be built and the area to be made available for shipping. But it provided, from the women's point of view, a resource, a food source to the rest of the community. So the environmental scientists had actually signed off on this being stripped because they said it's just marshland, for want of a better term. And it was the social scientists who said, no, it's a major subsistence food resource for the women. That's what they live off, that's what they cook at the end of the day in their villages. And the men go out into the lagoon and they do their fishing, and the fish is sold to provide money. But the local people live off what they gather in these particular marshlands. And so we had to do a whole new environmental impact assessment that took into consideration what women cooked for dinner at night time. So this is where having that broader understanding of what the social environment and environmental impacts of what you're doing is really, really important, both in terms of the local community village levels or the coastal communities or the mountain communities, but also in the cities. It's just a slightly different way of communicating with people. Okay. So you need to then understand who are your stakeholders at the national level, your provincial and municipal level, and then at the village and community level. So this is what we really need to focus on in this particular table, where you're actually saying, what is the GEDC situation? What's the situation of women, people with a disability and so forth in the area where I'm going to do my work? I need to conduct a GEDC analysis. I need to start gathering data about what it is that people are doing in that area, and I need to make sure that I talk with women as much as I talk with men, and I need to make sure that we've included people with a disability in that discussion and so forth. And these are the kinds of questions you can ask and what you're actually looking for in terms of your concepts. Then you start planning and designing. What change do you want to achieve? And then what are your JETSI specific objectives? We would like to make sure that any NBS-based parkland facility is actually used safely by the most number of people. Now, the key issue when you're talking about including women and girls is, I hate to say this, but it's women's safety. So when we actually looked at one of the images that Jen Bin put up earlier, I think it was the parkland in Singapore, I did note that all of the computer-generated people on the pathway were all men. In Brisbane, it gets very, very hot. It's like Thailand, you know. So, and we all love to go out walking and bicycling and walking the dogs and so forth. We do that at 5 o'clock in the morning, and we do that at 5:30 to 6:30 at night, because then the sun is not quite up and the sun has basically gone down and the temperature drops by about 3 or 4 degrees. Okay, so when we're planning any kind of linear area in Brisbane, we need to start looking at how do we promote the safety of women and girls. Okay, so really, really good lighting. One of the things we don't do, but picking up on what Catherine was saying about Canberra, we have a cycleway that is perfectly delineated, that is in the shade. So the people who are bicycling, and they already have a breeze as a result of bicycling, are in the shade under these lovely big trees. And then the walking tracks are all in full sun. So anybody who's commuting to work on a bicycle, 10 minutes, 20 minutes on a bicycle in full shade. Anybody who's walking to work, 40 minutes, 45 minutes, has to do it in full sun. No! You need to think about what the requirements are of people who are actually using all of the facilities. So safety and security for women, shade and security for mothers with children and so forth, all of those kinds of more nuanced ways of understanding how areas are actually used and developed. So we need to develop a JETSI action plan that starts to impact the way in which you engage in your process, and what are the JETSI specific objectives you want your policy or project to achieve. So I've just finished working with CSIRO, which is our major science organisation here in Australia. They did not do any of this for the first 18 months of their 3-year project, and then they got a bit panicky because they were told that they had to have some JETSI input. So in I came and I gave some talks and so forth, and we got their commercially focused businesses to create JETSI specific objectives, and it just changed the way in which they thought about what they were going to do. And within that, they've actually had some businesses that have brought on specifically people with a disability, women with a disability. They've actually brought women into management as advisors. They've done a lot more community work, which is actually a little bit more broad in terms of who they're talking with. And the outcomes that we've seen in the last 18 months are just amazing. And probably of the, let's say, the 12 projects, 11 of them have achieved really, really good JETSI objectives and JETSI outcomes. So it's just changing the way you think from focusing only on the project to focusing on the context for your project. Okay. So then you need some, how will you achieve the changes that you want to do, develop JETSI focused activities and actions, and how will you know you've achieved these? This is a focus on JETSI transformative outcomes, which I'm going to be talking about in a little while, and developing some JETSI monitoring, evaluation and learning indicators. I'm going to be talking about that in our next session, because otherwise there's too much information in the first one, but how can you actually monitor what you're doing in JETSI terms? I've highlighted the focus on outcomes because from Australia's DFAT perspective, whenever they're judging whether a project has been successful or not, they look at the outcomes. And any project that actually has more than a $3 million investment is now required to have a major JETSI outcome. What is it that you are going to do for the people who are encompassed by the JETSI rubric? What are you going to do to make their lives better? What are you going to do to transform their lives? So we're actually seeing with the Asian Development Bank, most of the aid organisations, with DFAT, that this is now the key focus as we move from into the second quarter of the 21st century. What are your outcomes in terms of what you're doing? So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Whoops, okay. So in the RID JETSI document that has already been sent through to your head office, tool number 2 is looking at the regional office JETSI action plan, and it's also it's under the implementation plan. So it's developing a resource plan for the JETSI action plan, conducting a baseline survey and analysing data in terms of the JETSI components, conducting consultation and engagement with communities, altering your project design based on your JETSI analysis and your community consultation. So you don't just do it and say, oh, that's good, thank you very much, and then not change anything. Okay? You actually physically alter what it is that you're going to do based on your consultation, implementing JETSI actions relevant to the project, measuring progress, and doing your monitoring and evaluation. So very, very straightforward, very simple. It's not rocket science, but it does require a slightly different way of thinking. So how do we include people with a disability? Because a lot of people say, I don't know how to talk to people who have a disability. I might say something wrong, and we get terribly modest and shy and so forth. But one of the easiest ways of doing this, particularly if you're engaging with communities, is to use the Washington Group questions on disability, which we've also got in your RID JETSI implementation plan. So what these are, they're actually very, very gentle questions about what your physical abilities might be. And they focus on, do you have difficulty seeing even if you're wearing glasses? Do you have difficulty hearing even if you're using a hearing aid? Do you have difficulty walking or climbing steps? Remembering or concentrating? Do you have difficulty with self-care such as washing all over and dressing? And then using your usual customary language, whatever that might be, do you have difficulty communicating, for example, understanding or being understood? So these questions enable you to begin very gently to understand what some of the lesser levels of disability in a community might be, and then planning for them. And that might be, for example, in Australia, where we actually have in an NBS project and we have information panels, we might have some of those panels available in Braille for people who are visually impaired. We might also have a particular kind of button that can be pressed that people who have a hearing impairment can actually pick up on a special connection on their mobile phones. So it's planning for people to be more inclusive of them. It's like giving your community a huge hug. So that's how we can very gently include people with a disability. We also have a whole lot of disability inclusion standards, which those of you who are architects might be very much aware of. And what we have here are sustaining systems for climate resilient WASH, which is one of the projects that a team that I know of has worked on, looking at the disability inclusion and the sustainable development goals, and then purposefully including the most vulnerable groups. So if you're dealing with a refugee community, for example, making sure that refugees with a disability are actually included. Female refugees with a disability are actually included. That's where that intersection comes in. So one of the other ways that we can link back to what the United Nations would like us to do also is the idea of multi-stakeholder engagement. So what we're actually trying to do here is to link many different and diverse stakeholders and human rights holders. So what you actually might have in terms of your stakeholders are government, other government departments, other ministries, provincial departments. It might be some major companies, construction companies that are building some of your work for you and so forth. So you've got those stakeholders, but the people in your community are essentially considered to be human rights holders. So they might not have a very strong voice, they might not have a very strong capacity to have their concerns heard, but they do have human rights under all of those conventions that Thailand has signed. So what we're actually trying to do here is to empower people as human rights holders to realise their rights, to be able to talk about what's being done in their community, and then to strengthen the state as duty bearers to comply with their human rights obligations. So essentially that's people who work in government. You have a duty to uphold the human rights of the people in your communities. So it's your right as a duty bearer to make sure that you're not actually damaging the human rights of people in the communities. And so we might be looking at government agencies, NGOs, large private corporations, aid donors, international policymakers, and also members of local communities. You need to factor them in as being as important as any government or private sector organisation. So we've got ways in which we can talk about that, and this is actually talking about integrating climate change adaptation into Thailand's agricultural sector, and this is looking at some of the economic issues that arise from that. So this is where I want to come back to the idea of we're looking at JEDC transformative outcomes. We're looking at ways in which we can actively have benefits on and enhance people's lives. So, for example, when I get DFAT sending through to me funding proposals, I will read those proposals, and for most of the projects I'll be saying, what are the ways in which they're going to enhance the lives of people by doing this water project or this irrigation project or this agricultural project? And if they say something like, of course we understand that gender is very important, but rivers don't have a gender, so we don't address it in this proposal. I'll be saying, well, I'm really sorry, but in many, many communities, rivers actually do have a gender. There might be a river god who is female, or there might be a river god who is male. But in actually making that statement about, of course we understand gender, but we're not going to do it, I would take that proposal and I would put it in a pile over here, and I would not look at it again. So I would then take up the next proposal and I would be saying, okay, what have they written about how they're going to incorporate gender and JEDC into their work? And if they're starting to say, we're going to incorporate it at the earliest stage of project planning possible, we understand that we will need to work with this particular ministry, we need to work with that construction company, we need to work with these communities. Well, we will be going to all of those organisations and communities to find out from their diverse employees and community members what their key issues are. So right from the start, before you even put CAD onto your screen or press a button, you're looking at how you can include them. And once I've actually started to read that, I will say, okay, this is interesting. So it then becomes, how are you going to do it? Because you've already shown that you recognise that it's an issue, how are you going to do it? So what we then want to start to look at is promoting the agency of members of local communities so that they have the space to influence the project's outcomes. So it may well be that in some of the nature-based solutions parklands, if you go out and you talk to women, they might well say, we would really like some lovely shaded areas where we could take our children, the babies in the pram, the toddlers, and the little 5 and 6 year olds, and they can play safely in a cool shaded area. Now, we did that in Brisbane about 20 years ago when the South Bank parklands were being developed and they were being expanded to include children's play areas. And the City Council actually went to the local ratepayers and said, what is it that you want? And the women said, we want play areas for the children, but it gets so hot in Brisbane that we need places where they can play safely, where there's lots of water. They can't play near the river, they might fall in, it's a fast flowing river, it's got sharks in it, you want to keep the children away from the river. So they designed a series of fountains that actually would spurt up water at various different times, and you can just go, when you're there on a Saturday or a Sunday, you just see the children running in and out, and then accidentally or deliberately getting splattered with water as they're running around, and there's shrieks of delight and so forth, and it's very lively. But the City Council actually designed a solution to the play area that kept the children cool and safe. So again, we're looking at the context of the actual technical work that we want to do. So you're promoting agency, giving them space to influence the project's outcomes, what it's going to look like. So then, to be effective or empowering, what we want in terms of stakeholder engagement and community consultation is to actually move along this continuum. And this is in section 5.2 of the RID implementation plan. So when I worked with some of the resource companies around 20-something years ago, they were very, very good at informing. So they would walk into a consultation room in a community in Western Queensland, and they would say, "Good afternoon, thank you very much for coming. We're here to tell you what we're going to do to you." And I'd be sitting there, this is so embarrassing. And they would proceed then to tell the community what their company was going to do. You know, tear down these houses, put a road through here, you'll have 2,000 trucks coming through for the first 3 years of the project and so forth. So we then persuaded some of the more enlightened members of staff to move from information to consulting. So actually sitting down with people in small groups of 6 to 8 people, saying, what is it that you would like to see? And of course, local people had lots of ideas. They didn't want 2,000 trucks coming through on a daily basis. They said, can you build a road that goes around our city centre so that the trucks actually don't come through the main section? Women's safety was a concern, because when they actually built these major projects, they would have construction camps of 3,000 men who would be coming in from interstate to work on the project. And these are people that the local community didn't know. So they were going, whoa, we've got girls and boys and teenagers, and so, well, what are you going to do about making sure that our town remains safe? And so the company had to consider that. So the consultation gave them extra information. Involving people, that's where you got the fountains that keep the children happy on the weekend, because the fountains are actually spurting water out all over the place. Really, really important, particularly for nature-based solutions, is actually collaborating with people. What is it that people want to see? How can you get them actually working with you? How can you get them to begin to take over the project so that you don't need to worry about what the next 20 years of maintenance is going to be? Particularly for something that is more low technology, how can you collaborate with them to actually create things? And then what is your empowerment? How can you actually place final decision making into the hands of the public so that they feel as though whatever it is that's been created is their own? They're going to look after it. They're not going to sabotage it. That is the maximum brilliant outcome. So what we want to do is to move from Jetsy harmful, yes, we recognise that there are men and women, but rivers don't have a gender, so we're not going to address it. That's harmful. That's exploitative. All the way through to, we're going to address it. We don't quite know how, but we're definitely going to address it. A bit dodgy. All the way through to Jetsy transformative. How are we actually going to benefit the people who are going to be using this area? How can they take on board what we're doing? And this is what most of the funding agencies are now looking at, and that's where your outcomes come in handy. What is the outcome that you are going to have? For example, a nature-based solution-based park. We are going to have safe and secure areas where children can play. We are going to have safe, well-lit areas where female and male joggers can jog at dawn and dusk. We are going to have washrooms that are male and female separate, and also washrooms for non-binary people. We are going to have areas that actually speak to the concerns of our local community. So that's really what we're looking for in terms of stakeholder engagement and community consultation. So that means that when you're actually thinking about your project, you need to create Jetsy outputs. And it might be, for example, a numeric output. Increase the number of women and girls and people with disability as entrepreneurs in small to medium climate resilient water enterprises in 4 communities in X regional city in Y province. Now that is a really, really good output indicator. And that might be harvesting rainwater. This is what we're going to do, and we're going to have women and girls running organisations and entrepreneurial activities that harvest rainwater. You might find that you can actually create women's collectives to ensure the optimal use of water in agriculture by employing water-saving technologies. And so you've got these kind of examples where you can bring in climate resilience into the GEDSI outputs that you're creating. As I indicated before, you must create a GEDSI outcome. Even if you're not being funded through DFAT and you're under a $3 million project, it gets you into this framework of thinking about the social context in which you're operating. So a GEDSI outcome for the overarching project might be poor women, people with a disability and socially vulnerable groups have access to climate resilient access to water that can withstand extreme weather events. So this might be assessing water security threats, improving access to climate resilient wash services, planning and managing water resources. So these are ways in which your overarching outcome is going to benefit impoverished women and people with a disability. And then you must develop clear practical statements about your GEDSI activities in order to move the project to GEDSI transformative. If you're doing those, and particularly if you have a GEDSI outcome, you can work backwards from it. This is what I want to achieve. It's like writing a PhD. You sort of say, I want to write a PhD about irrigation in Thailand. Okay? So your outcome is a major essay on irrigation in Thailand. How are you going to do it? You work back from what it is that you want to achieve. Okay? So this is what allows you to achieve it. And then you must collect GEDSI disaggregated data. You actually have to have data in which you've got the numbers of women versus the numbers of men, the numbers of women and the numbers of men who have a physical disability or an invisible disability, the age groups of the people who are in your particular stakeholder engagement. Do they have refugee status? What is their ethnic group? What are the languages that they actually speak in their religion? Is income difference important? So you can then show that you've engaged with as broad a group of people as possible. Okay. So these are just some examples.